Okay, my name is Hugh Lloyd Ellis, as those of you who don't know me, and I'm very pleased to introduce this year's Mackintosh Lecture. I want to say a few words about William Archibald Mackintosh first, and then I will introduce today's speaker. So Mackintosh was a major force in building Queen's University into one of Canada's leading institutions of higher learning. I would say actually the leading institution of higher learning. Born in 1895, Mackintosh entered Queen's in 1912 and left with both a BA and an MA just 4 years later. He returned in 1920 with a PhD from Harvard. In 1927, at the age of just 32, which is kind of amazing when I think about it, Mackintosh became head of the Department of Political and Economic Science. After a 7-year wartime stint in the service of the nation, he returned to Queen's in 1946 to serve as Dean of the Faculty, and then from 1951 to 1961 as Principal. Mackintosh wrote numerous books and articles, primarily about Canadian economic history, international trade, and economic policy. He was particularly interested in the period of development in which Canada became a nation, and his book, The Economic Background of Dominion-Provincial Relations, published in 1940, was the classic work on the economic history of Canada up until that time. Mackintosh had an important influence on economic policy, both in Canada and internationally. He had a strong working relationship with the Mackenzie King government during the 1920s and played an important role in expounding the implications of Keynesian analysis for Canadian economic policy. That's ISLM. Remember that, students? Right. During the crucial Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, Mackintosh served as special advisor to the Ministry of Finance, helping to create the institutional architecture that governs international trade and finance to this day. In 1967, Mackintosh was awarded the very first Innes Guerin Medal of the Royal Society of Canada, their highest honor for a social scientist. This year's Mackintosh lecturer is Robert E. Hall. Professor Hall is the Robert and Carol McNeil Joint Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and is a professor in the economics department. He received his PhD from MIT and subsequently worked at both MIT and Berkeley before arriving at Stanford University in 1978. Apparently not long before Lorne Carmichael, I understand, who he supervised. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. Professor Hall is one of the most well-known academic economists in the world. He has served as president, vice president, and Eli lecturer of the American Economic Association, and is a distinguished fellow of the association. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Sciences and fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Society of Labor Economists, and the Econometric Society. He also served as director of the research program on economic fluctuations and growth of the National Bureau of Economic Research from 1977 to 2013, and continues to serve as chairman of the Bureau's Committee on Business Cycle Dating, which maintains the semi-official chronology of the US business cycle. Like Mackintosh, throughout his career, Professor Hall has also had an important influence on economic policy. He has advised several government agencies on US economic policy, including the Justice Department, the Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve Board, and the Congressional Budget Office, where he serves on the Advisory Committee. He served on the National Presidential Advisory Committee on Productivity, and also has testified on numerous occasions before congressional committees concerning national economic policy in the US. Professor Hall's research is extensive both longitudinally and cross-sectionally. He's been publishing in the top journals in economics since the start of his career, with a restud in 1968 and an AER in the following year, I think 67, sorry, got the is it really? Oh, congratulations. And he continues to do so, for example, with a forthcoming Journal of Political Economy with Andreas Müller. During that time, he has made substantial contributions to almost every subject of macroeconomics, as well as other areas of economics. Consumption behavior, employment, and unemployment, productivity, capital formation, financial activity, inflation, technology, competition, economic policy, and on and on and on. I think the first dynamic macroeconomics paper I studied in graduate school was stochastic implications of the life cycle hypothesis, theory and evidence, from the JPE in 1978. It's still on most grad macro reading lists. Today, whenever I and most other macroeconomists write a paper on pretty much any subject, they're going to be citing an important article by Robert Hall. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Robert Hall as this year's Mackintosh Lecturer. So Robert will take questions during the talk, if you'd like, and we'll have some time for questions at the end too.
Actually, in fact, I wouldn't limit it to questions. If you have contrary opinions, that's also very welcome, since there are many people in this audience who might well have contrary opinions. So it's a great honor to give this lecture. I looked at the list of other people, and it's kind of humbling to look at that list. It's also wonderful to be in Canada, which have fundamental Canadian roots. My father was born in Canada, came to the U.S. Thinking he was going to college, but forgot to go back. But taught me the importance and many wonderful features of life in Canada. Okay, so today I'm going to talk. Well, first of all, let me mention a previous Mackintosh lecture, Robert Solow. The economics that I'll be talking about today is very strongly derived from work that he did in the 1950s. When I arrived as a graduate student at MIT in 1964, the profession had just completely assimilated Solow's contributions. He was an amazing, conspicuous, influential figure in the profession, and especially at MIT. He became my thesis advisor as well. And I've always done work that I think is very strongly influenced, and what I'm going to talk about today in particular is very growth-oriented. It's not fluctuations macro. We're going to kind of sidestep that issue and look at the effects around a growth path that policy can have in particular. And that'll be the second half. The organization of my remarks today is in two parts. One is to talk about what's happened to the U.S. economy, but I talk about the U.S. economy because obviously it's the one I know best by far. But the things I'm going to talk about actually have occurred in quite a few other advanced economies. In particular, the disappointment about real wage growth. So I'm going to document labor earnings in a particular measure that I think is the most relevant one, and I'll describe that in a minute. And show in particular that, especially since the year 2000, real wage growth has been very poor in the U.S. and several other similar countries. So we're going to go into that in some detail and use a growth framework and a growth decomposition of the type that Solow pioneered. Solow introduced log linearization as a central tool of macroeconomics. This is log linearization taken to its logical limit, you may feel, when I get done. Okay, so after going through that, then I'm going to talk about policy improvements, but I'm going to focus on one, and an aspect of one that's very salient today, and that is the benefits that workers would achieve if capital taxation were lower. The interesting thing is that right now there's a debate going on raging in the US about proposals to lower tax rates on capital. I'm not going to talk about that except in a kind of a general framework. This is not a talk about policy debates today. But not a single advocate of lower capital taxation has pointed out that central beneficiaries of lower capital taxation, which generates more capital. That's not hard to see. But more capital means higher wages. So reducing the tax rate on capital benefits workers. And that, oddly, that's not figured at all in the case that advocates have made. They've talked about growth in general, but they neglected the fact that the growth in particular goes to labor because the marginal product of labor increases when there's more capital. And I think it's pretty much agreed that if you reduce capital taxation, you'll get more capital. But the benefits of that, I think, in some ways haven't been fully identified. So I'll talk about that and show you some pictures showing that although that's true, it's a complicated issue. It doesn't all happen instantly, in particular. But the timing of it, I think, is something that everyone needs to look at carefully. Okay, so the variable that I'm going to decompose, solo style, is real earnings per member of the population. So, and this is going to be contrasted to those who look at earnings per worker. So this is not going to be a wage rate. It's not how much people make per hour. It's what the working segment of the population creates through the wages that they've earned in real terms, adjusted for inflation, and stated per member of the population. So things that have happened in the US, for example, that are important recently, the decline in the size of the labor force, are going to show up as a negative factor in this variable, even though they don't if you just look at something like hourly wages. And that helps helps me understand where some of the things that have happened. So as I mentioned, this encompasses changes in the labor force and in unemployment, as well as what workers who are on the job make on an hourly or weekly or annual basis. So I'm going to look at these things before taxes and transfers. So I'm really talking about what labor creates in the economy as opposed to necessarily what becomes available for workers to consume. I will later talk about overall consumption, but this is very much focused on the topic of what labor contributes as measured by their before-tax earnings and before transfers. So taxes are a negative for earnings, transfers are a positive for household income, especially for lower income households. I'm not going to get into that. This is much more about the capabilities and the things that workers deliver as opposed to what they necessarily get after the government has done its job in both directions. Okay, so if you're interested in pursuing this, almost all these calculations come from a terrific spreadsheet that John Fernald creates as a public service on the website of the San Francisco Federal Reserve. So in this one, you get essentially, it's all derived from government data, but it's all organized in a way that you can just immediately do all these calculations. It's a great resource, and it's kept updated on a quarterly basis by the staff of the Federal Reserve. So if you Google John Fernald spreadsheet, it'll be the first hit, and it's a very useful resource. I recommend it highly. Okay, so then technically in terms of what's in that spreadsheet, the one thing that's not in the spreadsheet, by the way, is population. You have to get that separately, but once you've got that, total real earnings divided by the population is the starting point for this analysis. Okay, so now let's talk about a decomposition of the type that goes with solo growth economics. First of all, total real earnings is the share. This is just the definition of the share. If you move this over to this side, then you say labor share equals real earnings divided by real output. It's the fraction of real output that makes its way down the chain to that I've described to workers. But we can actually now decompose this because Fernald would tell us the labor share, and then we can just calculate the earnings in this particular concept that we're using here just by multiplying labor share by output. Okay, then we're going to break down real income into productivity per unit of labor input and the volume of labor input. So that's going to rest on a definition of productivity, which is output per quality adjusted hour of work of workers. So this is a very standard number. This is a number that actually gets covered in the financial press quite frequently and in detail. It's called labor productivity, as opposed to the other concept of productivity, which you may be familiar with. That's total factor productivity. The two tend to move together. The difference between the two is that total factor productivity takes account of the contribution of capital, which is useful in some places, and it's something we actually will talk about later, but it's not the concept that I think fits most naturally. That labor productivity is what fits most naturally into a discussion of earnings. So productivity is output divided by hours. And the denominator, quality adjusted total hours, is just it's the economist's measure of what labor is delivering to the economy. Okay, so now we can decompose this into hours per worker. We're going to get the remember what we're decomposing is labor input. That's hours, quality adjusted hours. So it's hours per worker times the index of the quality of hours, which is something that Fernald creates out of government data, and workers per member of the labor force. So we are going to bring the labor force into the story because we want to look at labor force participation, times members of the labor force per working age person. So that's the ratio of the labor force to the total population. These are all numbers that change. Some of them change a lot, some of them change not so much. And then finally multiply that by working age people as a fraction of the total population. So these are all different things that move around. Yeah?
Just to clarify, so what's quality mean here? Age-based, or is it?
It's basically an education adjustment. It's done by looking at relative wages of different education and other demographic groups. But the thing that makes it different from just plain hours is you get a bigger contribution if somebody has more education. So we want to. This is a way that education can be brought in as a contributor to earnings and identified. As you'll see, it didn't move very much over this period. The U.S. has reached almost stationarity with respect to education. So it's not actually, people talk correctly that if we could boost education more, it would boost earnings, but there's not much of a trend in that direction today in the U.S. economy. There was in earlier decades, but there hasn't been more recently. Okay, so we're going to wind up with, from this whole thing that I just went through, a 7-way breakdown. I'll show you 7 different plots of how all these different things have contributed to the stagnation of wages. Some of them are going to be much more important than others. We can basically focus, based on this decomposition, in a few of them: the labor productivity, labor share, and the size of the labor force. Those are the big 3 that are going to come out of this. The rest of them turn out to be much smaller, but still worth looking at. Okay, so first of all, here's the numbers. And this is kind of scary because we had very good growth about through the year 2000. And since 2000, until quite recently when we started moving up again. And you can see some of the basic things that show up here. One is that there's a decline in real earnings per member of the population every time there's a recession. So there was a deep recession in 81, 82, and it just generated here. There's another recession in 1990. There was a recession in 2001, and then there was the worst recession of this period. In fact, the worst recession since the Great Depression, starting at the very end of 2007 through 2009. And you can see that had a really large proportional effect compared to what we saw earlier. So this is what we want to talk about. The year 2000 turns out, not in just, you can see dramatically that there was just a cessation of growth in the year 2000. A lot of things seemed to go badly, and not just in the U.S. economy, but certainly very much in the U.S. economy, we had very good earnings growth throughout this period, pretty much the same rate. These, by the way, these are your logs, so the slope here is the rate of growth. That's inherent in the Solo's log linearization, that we look at logs. So these are log points. So from here to here, 10 log points, that is 10% change. So we had very good growth through 2000, and then very poor growth until the recession, the Great Recession, as some people call it. And then the growth that we've had since then, since 2009, has been at quite a good rate, but most of that, as you'll see, is attributable to people going back to work, the reduction in unemployment, as opposed to things that are sustainable. This increase is not sustainable because most of it is just clawing back from what was lost so dramatically, mostly in the year 2009. So if you looked at this from here to here, you might say, oh great, growth has resumed. But when you take it apart into the 7-way decomposition, you'll see, looking forward, which I'm not going to try to do formally, but so much of this comes from the fact that unemployment was 10% of the labor force here, and it's down to 4% of the labor force here. And that's 6 percentage points right there, and that's a big factor, and one that we can't push the unemployment rate too much below 4%. We might get to 3.5%, but the U.S. economy has never had a significant period of time with unemployment less than 3.5%. So we're pretty close to having extracted the maximum out of putting people back to work. If we want to get further earnings growth, it has to be in areas like productivity and participation, and not in reducing unemployment. Okay, so let's start. One of the components we're going to talk about is productivity, output per employed hour, quality adjusted hour, and you can see right away that that's going to be an important part of the story. That one of the things that has gone wrong in the U.S. economy, not so much starting in 2000. So here's 2000. Productivity growth actually continued until about the middle of that decade, about 10 years ago. Then, as often happens, productivity growth sagged in 2000 in the recession. It popped back. But then since then, productivity growth has been particularly bad in the U.S. economy. And diagnosing that has not gone very far. I wish I could say more. I was part of a team that published a paper in the Brookings Papers on economic activity that came out a few months ago. If you're interested in further discussion of productivity, we did everything we could, ran every regression that we thought, but we didn't find much. The decline in productivity growth over the last 6 or 8 years in particular has not yielded any particular explanations. It followed a period of rapid productivity growth. Productivity growth was particularly good in the 1990s. As you can see here, right in this period. Didn't slow down in 2000, but did slow down especially recently. So you're going to see that the story of stagnation of earnings has different things operating at different times. The combination of everything was deadly, as you saw in this picture. At different times, there's different negative factors. But since 2000, the U.S. economy has encountered terrific headwinds as far as earnings growth go. As I say, from different sources, but overall, kind of a disaster. Okay, then the next thing to remember is the labor share of income. So earnings there's a pie of total output that is produced by the economy. And and then part of that goes to owners of firms, and part of it goes to workers. The fraction going to workers, the labor share, by the way, you might say, this is not a very good graph, right? We should move it up and make it wiggle more. But all these pictures have exactly the same scale. So what I'm emphasizing here is that in log form, all these get added together. So if you can visually take all these pictures, you can literally just stack them in your brain and not be confused by the fact that I use different scales. So there's a logic to what would otherwise flunk your Excel skills course. But I have to say, one Excel skill that's important is always use a thick line. The number of people who make the mistake of using a skinny line that you can hardly see, and worse than that, making it in yellow or green, which are invisible colors. So use a bold color and make them nice and wide. Okay, so labor share, this is one I can reach. The labor share was pretty constant from 1980, and in fact, even if you go back earlier, it was constant. And then again, magic year 2000, the tide turned against workers, and the labor share, until quite recently, we don't know yet what to make of this recent increase, but over this period, with some ups and downs, there's been a downward trend. And that's a significant contributor to the slowdown in earnings growth during this period. Again, there's a very lively literature. David Otter, who was a speaker here, I guess, in 2015, yeah, 2 years ago, has been working hard on this question. Other people, it looks like changes in industrial structure, in particular, as Otter likes to say, firms, superstar firms. Superstar firms tend to have lower labor shares. They're more capital intensive, or at least they generate more profit. So part of this story, an important part, in my opinion, is growth in market power of some firms. It's not that all firms in general are increasing their market power. It's that firms with substantial market power are growing faster. So, for example, Google, which has a product that is essentially zero marginal cost. So its markup of price to marginal cost is extremely high. And if you work through the economics of it to look at the resulting share, anything that raises the ratio of price to marginal cost generates a corresponding reduction in the labor share. Another way to put it that takes it right into Econ 1 is that if there's market power in the product market, it means that workers earn the marginal revenue product of labor. If you remember how the marginal revenue product looks relative to the marginal product, it lies below it. And that's the economics. The difference between the marginal product of labor if there's no market power and the marginal revenue product of labor if there is market power in the product market is what accounts for this, or at least in the story, which I believe. This represents a corresponding shift of marginal revenue product relative to marginal product. But that's lots and lots of work. It's become the topic in macro today. If you ask me, what's the exciting stuff that's going on in macro today? It's trying to measure market power, look at industry structure. There's a lot of different ways of doing it. Document higher concentration, and I think we're gonna make some progress in that area. It's always interesting. One thing I've noticed, having had a rather lengthy career in this subject, that most of the time you're not aware of the great advances that are being made. But this time I think we're focusing on this particular subject, illustrated by what's happening here, is generating a lot of interesting controversy and work. Yes?
So you talked about how it might have to do with concentration and so on. So if you graph that labor share of income for different aggregates, sort of manufacturing versus services, retail, et cetera, does it look similar?
It looks similar. That's a remarkable thing. it's not concentrated in particular sectors. It seems like the superstar phenomenon is actually in services, and it's definitely not concentrated in manufacturing, although it is present in manufacturing. Yeah, it's a widespread development. Otter in particular has done work demonstrating that, so I suggest you take a look at his stuff. Okay, so I think this is one of the big three of influences that has been going against the historical growth rate of earnings. Another thing, not so large, but present, is that hours per employed person, so you can think of that basically as weekly hours. And weekly hours in the American labor force concentrate at 40. There are some workers who consistently work more, there's some who consistently work less. There's somewhat of a business cycle. You can see here that hours decline in a recession, they declined in this recession, they declined in this recession. So there's somewhat of a business cycle, which means that this growth in hours since the Great Recession is mostly what you'd see in a recovery. And the U.S. economy's had a very strong recovery by measures like hours or unemployment, probably the strongest of all advanced countries. On the other hand, the downward trend, especially if you tried to take out the cycle, you'd have a downward trend like this. So it's not in the big three, but it's a phenomenon that's not received much attention. You can see it is a break in the period of when things were going so well for the American worker, hours were rising. Generally, there was no trend in hours. And then hours, again, what year? 2000, started downward. That's not received much study. As I say, it's not in the big three, but it's certainly a factor that has received zero attention as far as I know. Okay, so I mentioned before labor quality, which is primarily the contribution that earnings, that education makes to earnings, is a relatively small and fairly smooth factor. And that represents the fact that the education of the average worker is still rising because people retiring have less education than people entering. But that's not a very powerful force. And there is not anymore much of a tendency for each cohort of workers to receive more education. The fraction of the U.S. labor force finishing college, which is a key determinant of earnings, has hardly risen at all over the last couple of decades. So that's not, it's something that was a big factor earlier, but is not. You can see a certain amount of that. The growth rate through the 1990s was greater than since then. We've had a little bit of a rise here, but that, I'm afraid, is mostly the fact that things have gone so well. The college-educated people have not suffered the decline in participation that the less educated have, but it's not a sustainable change. Okay, now this is the simplest one to explain. This is the business cycle. I'm going to talk more tomorrow about this for anyone who wants to come to a seminar. But basically, the unemployment is the business cycle in the U.S. economy. If we didn't have fluctuations in unemployment, we really wouldn't have a business cycle. And you can see how important that is. It's important, but it's very transitory. So here we had the most serious recession, except the most recent one in 81, 82. This just is the mechanical fact that unemployment went from 5% to 10%, but transitorily. Unemployment tends to go back to normal, even though a lot of bad things are happening in the U.S. economy that we've uncovered so far. It remained true that unemployment went back to normal about its normal speed. there's been no tendency for unemployment to linger longer in the U.S. economy. People talk about a jobless recovery, which is true, but it's not joblessness in the sense of unemployment, meaning people who want to work are looking for work but don't have jobs. Rather, it's people, we'll come to this in a second, not participating in the labor market, not looking for work. So the growth here, the recovery here, was at about the same speed so there was unusually rapid recovery here, not so rapid after the 1990 recession, not so rapid after the 2001 recession, and pretty rapid. No sign that the U.S. economy has any problem with lingering unemployment. That's a very important thing to understand. The one thing that we don't need in this analysis is worrying about chronic joblessness. Today in the U.S. economy, measures of how easy it is for an unemployed person to find a job, the job finding rate of the unemployed is way up. By some measures, for example, the fraction of the labor force who enter unemployment in any given month is lower than it's ever been before in the U.S. economy since 1948. So unemployment is not the issue, and that's typical of the way that U.S. economy and some other economies, not so, it varies a lot across Europe, but in the U.S. we have a very powerful tendency for the economy to recover in the cyclical sense of driving unemployment back. Unemployment currently is 4.1%, which is way below its historical average, which is 5.8%, and represents, I guess the other side of this coin is that the difficulty that employers have of finding workers, which is measured by the duration of a job vacancy, is at an all-time high. All-time. We've only had a survey for that since 2001, but since 2001 we have a stronger labor market than ever before over that period. So one thing to say is that although unemployment is a very important factor, as you can see, this dip here was very substantial. Labor took a big hit, but we got back to normal. None of the other factors has this tendency of invariably getting back to normal. It's one of the most reliable things about the U.S. economy is that unemployment goes away, people find jobs, even though other things are pointing in the wrong direction. The thing that is good is after a big shock. It would be even better, of course, if we didn't have these big shocks, if we had a more stable economy so we don't have a decline like we had, which was a major hit. But we recovered from it, and it was predictable that we did. Okay, so now this is another one of the big three, the labor force participation rate. And that's a very interesting story, and again, it's one that's getting a lot of attention, but not so far, and again, the Brookings paper that I mentioned goes into this in quite a bit of detail. So participation, the fraction of the population that is either working or looking for work, the labor force participation rate grew, flattened out in the 1990s, grew in the early 90s, flattened out, reached its maximum in what year? 2000. And then since 2000 has declined, and in particular since the Great Recession in 2008 has declined. I guess this plot doesn't show it, but it's actually turned up. If we extended this to recently, it's just turned up a little bit. So it looks, at least it's bottomed out. Participation does respond to the conditions in the labor market. Part of the decline that occurred after 2008 was high unemployment, but of course that factor's gone completely today. So it's no longer the case that jobs are hard to find And so that factor driving participation downward is no longer in effect. But we still have this big shortfall in participation. Now, it turns out that part of that is demographic. It's partly that people are moving into age groups where traditionally the participation is lower, that is, retirement occurs. That's, depending on how you measure it, that's between a third and a half of the decline since 2000, from its high point in 2000 to its current level. The total is 3 or 4 percentage points, depending on where you start and end it, and maybe 2 percentage points of that, or 1.5 is demographic. The rest is an interesting and complicated story, it appears. It seems to be quite a bit related to the issue of inequality of earnings. There are some people who, particularly the college educated, who've enjoyed rapid earnings growth. It appears to be partly a family phenomenon. If a family has a high earner, and it has other earners in it, for example, a 20-year-old, then the most 20-year-olds have not faced, obviously, they're almost certainly not college graduates. If they're not in college, then they're much less likely to be employed or looking for work than they have been historically. And that subject is, there's a famous paper circulating that blames part of this phenomenon on video games. So it used to be that 20-year-olds, the last thing they wanted to do was hang around at home, because home was a completely boring place. Then video games came invented, and now there's something fascinating to do at home. So a 20-year-old not in college might well have said, well, I might as well take a job. There's nothing else to do. I don't want to just hang around at home. But now, according to this paper, the paper doesn't claim that that's a very big phenomenon. But things like that, I think, it's more than just a detail, because that's definitely it's not the well-paid, college graduate on a career path that has a decline in participation at all. It's people in a more peripheral, belonging to demographic groups where earnings declines have occurred. So if you're familiar with the distinction between income and substitution effects, these are people for whom both the income effect and the substitution effect point in the same direction, that is, toward less work. Well, it's not a big surprise to an economist that there's not as much work going on. So it's related very much to this phenomenon. And again, David Otter is somebody who's documented this very explicitly, that we're seeing college graduates, specialists, people who are really good at their jobs, work hard in their jobs, have had earnings growth, and then a lot of other people have been left behind and have actually had real earnings decline. And that distributional effect shows up in participation. Yes?
Just a thought, if it's so hard for the worker, for the employers to find the workers, why aren't they raising the wages?
Ha! Very good question. Boy, I wish I knew. I would stop everything and write a paper, because that is a very salient issue.
You mentioned the product market not being competitive. I'm wondering also if the labor market isn't competitive. They have a lot of power. They have a lot of power to set the wages the same way they have power to set the prices. So it's not a competitive labor market, obviously, because if it was, the wages would raise. People don't want to enter the labor force, right? So I'm wondering if there's some issues going on.
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, there's a hesitation. The marginal revenue product point that I made before would apply here. I don't think we have a very good answer to that. I think it's fair to say, though, that the idea that market tightness is a driver of price and wage changes, the idea of a Phillips curve, was never on very firm ground to begin with. And it looked very bad in terms of the data recently, as you pointed out. So I think I would say, first of all, let's be careful. it's not obvious as a matter of economic theory that there should be a Phillips curve. You kind of have to stand on your head as an economist, in fact, to create a theory of the Phillips curve. For a while, people thought it was a fact, but it's just not a fact. There's a paper a few years ago by Stock and Watson that just took two econometricians just taking a completely honest look at the data. No horse in the race. Not committed professionally to either of the views. And they said it's just not there. It's never been there for wages, and in particular, it's not been there recently. So, but they say it's not something new. It's actually always the way wages have worked. So I find that kind of interesting and important. But I don't have a good answer. It still seems like the lack of, I guess the only further thing to say is there has been recently an increase in wage growth. So that's maybe a hint that something is going on in the expected direction.
Phillips curve there, this is jumps out to me as a big question. Why are these going up like a competitive model suggests in the future?
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting. So you're using the competitive model as the benchmark as opposed to
suggesting something really interesting is going on with wage formation that I don't understand.
Yeah. Okay. Well, again, the market power in the product market is enough to do it. So it doesn't have to be in the labor market. But of course, you're right. If there were an increase in monopsony power in the labor market, you'd see the same thing. So, and it's possible that superstar companies are monopsonists in their labor markets. I don't know. As a resident of Silicon Valley, what I see is a lot of the superstar firms are in Silicon Valley, like 6 out of the top 10. But they're all competing with each other. They all want to get the same kind of people. So that doesn't suggest that any one of them would have a lot of market power. But we'll see. Pardon? What did you say?
Walmart does, though.
Ah, yes. Okay, that's another story. Yes, right. Yeah, the only employer in town. Yeah, okay, that's a very different story. Yeah.
When did you disaggregate at one point? We find a lot of differences. Talking about Silicon Valley, and you can see departure. There's big differences. When people talk about university education, for example, or going to college, you find big differences in the earning power of engineers or medicos or people with mathematics training rather than somebody in arts, general arts degree.
Sure. Yes.
So when you disaggregate, I would think some of the mysteries start to disappear.
I think that actually they deepen. For example, there's been quite a bit of research done on across disaggregating by state, which is, I think, kind of an interesting thing to do. Well, it turns out there's a robust Phillips curve at the state level. But it doesn't show up when you add all the states together. It disappears. That's a complete mystery. I don't, I've played around with this a little, but it hasn't become part of my research, but I think it's a big mystery. If somebody, that would be a very good paper, reconcile the lack of an aggregate relationship between just a simple Phillips curve idea. It works very well at the state level, and it disappears when you add the states together. It's paradoxical. It's not, obviously econometrically you can say, well, there's some negative correlation that's accounting for that, but what the economics of that negative correlation is not something I have an answer to. No, I think it's a very ripe area for research. Okay. So the fraction of the population age 16 plus is not much of a factor. It's been growing for a long time, and that simply represents the fact that the baby boom generation, more recently the baby boom generation has started to retire, but they're still alive. But generally this is just a kind of a fundamental demographic decline in birth rates combined with lower mortality among retired people makes this a demographic reality, but it's not very big. So it's nowhere close to the top 3 influence. Okay, so let me remind you now. So we've been through the 7, and so I'll just remind you what these numbers look like again. That when you add all those together, you get this just surprise cessation of systematic real earnings growth starting in 2000. So just again, a reminder, the productivity is a very important part of that story. Fundamentally, productivity is the force that is kind of unlimited. The amount that productivity has risen since, say, the year 1800 is just astronomical. And there's no obvious principle of economics that it couldn't go on like that. There's still a lot of improvements, a lot of uses of modern technology that haven't yet been applied. But its recent growth is, notwithstanding that idea, is not very good. All the other variables are kind of limited. Unemployment is obviously the one that's most time limited because it goes away, reliably goes away. But things like labor force participation, I think, are inherently limited. So productivity, I think, in the eyes of most labor and macroeconomists, is the reliable principal driving force of earnings change. Earnings in any economic model, even if there's fluctuations in market power and anything like that, fundamentally the ability of the economy to produce output is going to, the growth of that is going to drive the growth of earnings. So if you did the kind of exercise we're talking about here and compared 1900 to today, it would be all productivity. So that's always the thing to think about. Of course, we don't have very good ideas about how to say policy for productivity is productivity is kind of a black box. We've been extremely unsuccessful in forecasting productivity growth. Then if you look at the sum of all the other things, all the 6 other factors that I've discussed, then you can see that until recently, they've added up to kind of a disaster with this extremely sharp peak in the year 2000. The year 2000 was the year everything went wrong. Now, some people say, well, that must be because of Bush. But none of these things seem particularly attributable to Bush, so I don't necessarily join that. But this extreme right turn in 2000 is just remarkable. Then the other, of course, huge factor, adding them all together, but a lot of it is just the unemployment, joblessness. And then the recovery, of course, again, is the recovery in joblessness. But the trend downward of these factors has just been remarkably negative. I'm not going to talk about it today. I think I've hinted at some of these things, but I think some of these factors are disappearing. Like we've had no further decline in labor force participation over the past year, almost 2 years now. On the other hand, this spurt of growth, as I said before, which is mostly decline in joblessness, can't go on since we've got very low unemployment rate. So who knows? It's a question mark in this direction. Okay, so that's the end of phase 1. So I think I've summarized all these things. All right, so policy reform. Now, there's a zillion different things we could think about in terms of policy. So I'm going to focus on one, partly because it's something I've been interested in, and I've been an advocate of reduced taxation on capital, not because I think that we should raise the income of people who own the capital, but rather because capital is an important factor input, and the more capital we have, the more people will earn. And to me, that's been a driving force of my belief in why reduced capital taxation would be a good idea. I'm going to think of this, though, in a somewhat more general sense than just cutting the corporate income tax or that sort of thing. I'm not going to get into that in any detail at all. I'm also going to think that there's other reforms that look a lot economically like reducing tax rates on capital. Having more intelligent regulation. I'm not a big believer in blanket deregulation. I believe in effective, competent government, not just getting government out of the way. And by and large, countries like the US and Canada, other advanced countries, have reasonably competent governments, or at least did until recently. But I'm still thinking that, if certain things could be straightened out, they would have effects like, they bear on capital, they have effects that are like a tax on capital. And one of them, for example, is another taxation. We often leave out property taxation, but a lot of capital in the US is subject to property tax by state and local governments as well as income taxes. And that probably has the same adverse effect on earnings. Okay, so I'm going to model that as a big reduction, a huge reduction, you might say, in tax rates on capital. The other thing, that there's this literature on policy uncertainty that there's one thing the government could do that would be useful, and that is stop the zigzags in policy. We've had increases in capital taxes, decreases in capital taxes, and other increases and decreases in regulation. A more competent, steady hand in government would probably also have a favorable effect through this effect of policy uncertainty. But I'm not going to try to quantify that. I'm just going to say that's another factor that looks like a capital tax. Okay, so just to set just so you can understand that in some sense capital is a problem and a contributor. I mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about productivity that the size of the capital stock is an important determinant of productivity per worker. And you can see that if you just look at capital per worker. This is just directly out of the data that I mentioned. So we had rapid growth, which I'm starting in 2000 here, so I'm dropping this comparison to pre-2000. But we had pretty satisfactory growth, an interruption in the Great Recession, and then some recovery. But since the Great Recession, capital growth per worker, we've had a big expansion in the number of workers thanks to the decline in unemployment, but not much of a response in investment. So another of the big mysteries, like lower participation, is very low business purchases of plant equipment and intellectual property, the three components of capital, have the growth of that of capital per worker has basically stopped. We've been since the Great Recession, we've just gone nowhere in terms of capital per worker after having historically had huge increases in capital per worker. So that lies behind. So that if you further dissected productivity, this would be something that we could identify as one of the reasons for low productivity growth. So that does suggest that there's something to look at here that is specifically related to capital, and that would be taxation of capital. The other thing that can be done is just to ask what's going on. So we have a theory of investment that says that, as usual, marginal this should equal marginal that, right? That's all there is to economics, is marginal this should equal marginal that. You just have to fill in the blanks. So it's in this case, it would be the marginal benefit of capital, the marginal product of capital, versus the price of capital. Well, it seems, we've entered a period of very low interest rates. We've had a spectacular appreciation of the stock market, such that the cost of funds in the stock market is very low. The expected return is low. So it seems like there should be a huge expansion of investment because we can't see that the marginal benefit, pre-tax at least, has been eroded, and the marginal cost through the cost of funds seems to be at an all-time low. Every financial measure, real interest rates, expected returns are in the stock market, they're all way down. And yet what's happened to the marginal benefit of capital, which we can measure, it's the marginal product of capital, we can measure it using the same ideas as measuring the marginal product of labor. And what do you get? It turns out that at the same time that the marginal cost of investment has declined, the marginal benefit has mysteriously increased. So marginal this isn't equal to marginal that. There's something in between that is impeding. So here we got this huge benefit. Businesses should be investing like crazy according to standard investment theory. And there's a paper that's going to come out in a few months, also in Brookings papers, that pushes this idea hard, and I think correctly, that there's something really bizarre happening. Of course, one of the answers could be this market power idea, and that I think the authors of the paper I just mentioned believe that. But there's something going on, and it seems like there's something going on that's like a tax. You could say if marginal this isn't equal to marginal that, maybe we left out a tax on the marginal benefit such that the tax is very high, and when you look at the after-tax marginal benefit, it does equal the marginal cost. That would be a huge change. So this picture, so here is the cost of capital, let's say, is in this range. So this should have come down like this, based on what happened in financial markets. So there's this big, big gap, which sort of looks like a tax. So let's pretend that it's a tax and pursue that idea because we know exactly, I think, how to, or I shouldn't say exactly, but we have a good handle on how taxes should be entered in a growth model. So I'm going to talk about a very simple model. This model is very intentionally captures very standard ideas. These are ideas that were around when I was a graduate student. I won't say how long ago that was, but I think they're still relevant. And this is very much going to be a growth style analysis and not a Keynesian style analysis, which for when you're looking this far into the future, given how quickly unemployment disappears, Keynes's big contribution to macro was to say we got to pay attention to unemployment. We got to understand why in the Great Depression there was very high levels of unemployment. So that was a good idea. But looking forward, since unemployment is now not a factor in the U.S. economy, let's have a neoclassical Solow style analysis. Okay, so if you've studied growth theory at all, you know Solow's growth theorem. Not everyone calls it that, but we need to keep in mind that reforms by Solow principles can raise the level of some economic variable, like real earnings, the thing we've been talking about today, but they can't raise the growth rate in the long run. The growth rate in the long run is set by kind of fundamentals. The two main fundamentals would be population growth and productivity growth. And unless we have a magic policy that can make productivity grow faster every year in the future, that would be outside the assumptions of the Solow theorem. But I see no evidence that that's true, so we're going to stick with Solow's idea, which you could have an economy that's growing, and it grows faster, but ultimately it's going to continue to grow at its previous rate. So I've actually built this model so that it looks at not the growth path, but the deviations from the growth path. And that makes the plots a lot easier to understand. Okay, so this is all really basic stuff. Cobb-Douglas production function, capital share of 0.3. One of the things that happened while I was a graduate student, which I participated in, was the development of forward-looking consumption theory. That ultimately resulted in this 1978 paper. So we're going to put that in. And that was sort of post-Solow, but it was very much something that fit into his 1956 setup. And we're going to have labor supply in a pretty standard way. And if you've studied labor supply, you know that in a dynamic setting, there's many different ways of measuring the wage elasticity of labor supply. In macroeconomics, we look at the Frisch elasticity because it's the relevant one for most setups. And that's the labor supply holding consumption constant. So that's basically thinking about holding wealth constant. So you eliminate the wealth or income effect. It's very close to the substitution elasticity of labor supply. So we make that a half. That's kind of a standard number. And then we have government. This government taxes earnings, labor earnings at one constant rate, and that's important actually, and capital income at another constant rate. And then, of course, as the growth rate fluctuates during a reform, that's going to result in fluctuations in government revenue, and those fluctuations are absorbed by borrowing when revenue is unusually low and paying off the debt when its revenue is high, and not racking up an infinitely large debt, but keeping the debt under control. With a finite horizon, it means finishing at 500 years from now with no government debt. Okay, so this is a very standard model. The only thing that's not standard in terms of tax theory is this idea of thinking about tax rates that are constant. And that's important because there is work by my colleague Ken Judd that's quite famous that showed that if you're taxing an individual and include a tax on capital income, the tax should go to zero as that person ages. And you have to read that literature. I won't try to explain why that is today. And a lot of people read that literature and say, oh, well, that proves that the tax rate on capital should be zero. Even I believed that for a while. But it turns out that if you approach this problem realistically, that what governments do is generally set tax rates to be a particular rate, like the corporate tax rate in the US has been 35% for a long time. And they keep it constant. And then periodically they raise or lower it, but not in a forecastable way. So that people are expecting, as time goes by, that they're going to be paying the same tax rates now and in the future. So that's a different problem from the problem that Judd attacked. And there hasn't been nearly as big a literature on that because everyone got so excited about whether Judd's result was correct or not. But they didn't solve this other problem. But it's an easy problem to solve. So that's one thing that is a little bit. So very quickly, if you like, to understand the math here, this economy can be described by a system of 4 differential equations. It's exactly the same as the space agency's problem of setting the initial velocity, which is a 3 vector, 3 x, y, z, velocities of a spaceship that is to go around the moon and land near Fiji. So it's what's called a 2-point boundary value problem. The nice thing about that is that there's absolutely standard software for solving that problem. You don't have to, it's amazingly easy to write down these differential equations and put them into the standard software and you're done. So it's a lot easier than almost any other way of setting up any other model. And it's exact. No linearization here. There's so much of model solution in macro has been based on linearization, but you don't need to do that here. You get the exact answer. The space people would never linearize their system because it's just fundamentally nonlinear. Okay, so So we're going to maximize the discounted utility of the representative consumer worker. The earnings tax then turns out to be, the optimal earnings tax is 40%. The capital tax is not zero, but it's a lot lower. So those of us who got on board to the zero tax on capital, which is otherwise known as consumption taxation, weren't that far off. It's not, the difference between a 0 rate and a 13% rate is not a big deal in tax theory. The difference between 13% and the rate in the US today, though, is a very big deal. So here's what I'm going to say. Tax rate on capital, 70%. So if you look at the federal tax rates on capital, they add up to about 55%, 35% at the corporate level, but then that income is taxed again at a 20% rate. So the compounding of those is in the 50% range. So that's a big number. But of course, I mentioned before, there's property taxes. Plus, I'm thinking of this as kind of a more general reform. Other good things happen. And if you plug in 70% and say that government purchases are 35%, or government spending is 35% of GDP, this is consolidated government, state and local plus federal, then you solve out to get the tax rate that balances the budget is 29%. Okay, so we're going to reform, and this is going to stay with a balanced budget. None of this $1.5 trillion that the Republicans have given themselves recently. Going to stay with balancing the budget. That means the earnings tax, labor earnings tax, has to increase to 37%. And then in these calculations I did, I actually had this reform cuts the rate on capital to 8%. So this is a big deal. We're going to shift. We're going to be consumption tax people, which means that we have to have a higher, we have to have, say, a value-added tax, which is a consumption tax. And we're going to have to raise that somewhat, and then we're going to have this dramatic reduction in the capital rate. So what happens? That's what we're going to talk about in the remainder. Okay, so, well, this talk was about wage rates, so let's talk about wage rates. So in all these pictures, 0 is the year when the reform occurs. I'd put -5 here just so you can see that the economy, if this reform had not occurred, this would be flat. Flat means no deviation from its growth path. The moment that people know that, and in fact, this goes into effect, so we have this. This is the moment of reform. The wage actually declines. So even though ultimately wages rise for the reason I mentioned at the very beginning and have emphasized, that capital potentiates workers. It gives them a higher wage. But it doesn't happen instantly. The reason is that, as you'll see in the rest of these pictures, the effect of this is to create temporarily a situation in the economy that is very favorable to labor supply. Nothing happens to unemployment. This model doesn't know about unemployment, but it does know that if there's a temporary period when it's a really good idea for a lot of people to be working, then that'll happen. That inevitably, since the capital stock can't respond instantly, capital stock can only respond as investment accumulates over time, and I'll show you just how much it rises, which is really a lot. So that what happens initially is that there's a big increase in employment, and that has to reduce the marginal product of labor. More workers, downward sloping marginal product schedule. So the wage has to fall immediately. It falls a lot. So although intertemporally, this is a great plan, and it increases the utility that families derive from the economy, on the earnings side, they have to make a sacrifice initially, something that you never hear about in the tax reform public discussions. Economists know about this, but Okay, so you get a dip and then an increase. You finally get back after about year 6 or 7. Here you are back to where you were before, and then for the rest of time, as long as this tax rate remains in effect, it permanently raises the level, but through Solo's theorem, it does not increase the growth rate. So when tax reformers say it's going to give us 1 percentage point more growth rate, you can tell they're not in tune with the Solo theorem. And a student of Solo's, I think he was right and they're wrong. So that's something that, is balancing. You have to, from the family's point of view, if a family has only wage earnings, then they're going to go through a period of lower wage earnings, and then later enjoy permanent increase, temporary decrease, followed by permanent increase. Okay, the reason for this decline in the wage, as I mentioned, is that there's a spike of employment. It's a spike of the labor force. Remember, there's no unemployment here, so this is not putting unemployed people to work. This is drawing people into the labor force through a calculation that they do that says this is a good time to work, even though the wage is lower. You have to spend some time seeing how that works, but I don't have time to go into details now. Okay, so here's the big deal. Here's what happens to the capital stock. Again, Solo's theorem applies. It's not the case that there can be any increase in the growth rate of the capital stock. All effects of things like reform that can't touch the permanent rate of productivity growth are going to eventually flatten out. But notice it takes more than a decade for this all to happen, and that's because the capital stock can only be increased by diverting consumption today, and there's a limit to the amount of consumption that can be diverted. That's standard life cycle consumption theory. So you have to wait for time to go by, combine the resistance of households to enduring a current reduction of consumption, but recognize that they'll respond and accept some reduction in exchange for the benefits that they get when the capital stock becomes much higher. Notice that more than the capital stock more than doubles thanks to this very large decline in this main obstacle to investment, which is high taxation. Okay, so I've mentioned consumption already. The consumption hit is not as big as the earnings hit, but it's immediate, and then consumption then immediately starts to grow, and then again, like everything else, has to flatten out, but at a higher level. So that's the household is trading off the fact that they're going to get more consumption, but at the cost of having to work harder. Part of the consumption comes from them working harder. A lot of it comes from having accumulated a larger capital stock. So this is so there's a lot of trade-offs. Trade-offs over time, current sacrifice, permanent benefit. Permanent benefit in the level, but not in the growth rate. So there's a lot of stories here that don't get told by the advocates of change. Even I think it's fair to say, had not really thought this through until I recently did these calculations. But now that I've done it, I realize that we have to be honest about what happens. This would be a big increase in lifetime satisfaction, but achieved, as so many things are, by a period of investment and lower levels of consumption and earnings. One last thing I wanted to mention is since we're on the topic of taxation and the budget, there's an assumption built into what I just described about how government works. That assumption, which is that it doesn't mindlessly go broke, applied very strongly to government in general. So this is all government units in the U.S., federal, state, local, all added together, consolidated government. so when you look at this, you can see that there would be periods. So first of all, this is cyclically adjusted. There's a big swing in a decline in taxation revenue and increase in government spending that's transitory because it's driven by unemployment. We can get rid of that by essentially taking the part of it that's responsive to unemployment out, just a regression on unemployment. So that's what's done here. And that's kind of a standard thing to do. So you can see that most of the time revenue of consolidated government has been below the spending, and that's okay in a growing economy. That works. So we can live with that. There was a tendency, though, to run fiscal policy in such a way that revenue would catch up with spending. So we did that in the 60s and 70s. Then there was kind of a temporary explosion, and these are ratios to GDP. So during this period, spending went up, but then spending came down. I shouldn't say so much that spending came down. This was a period when the economy grew very rapidly and spending was kind of stationary. So the ratio to GDP declined, and they almost touched. In the federal government, they actually did touch, but state and local government didn't. And then since then, we've had this very unusual widening. It's stronger than it was in the Reagan period, but especially recently, we've had the spending number continuing to rise, and the revenue number being flat. Notice the revenue has been flat as a ratio to GDP since the mid-70s. The trend in spending has been upward, especially since when? 2000, that magic year. And so the question is whether this is a death spiral. So a death spiral occurs when there's some behavior which gets more and more difficult to control, and then eventually everything collapses in a heap. So the question is government going to collapse in a heap? It's going to be a slow process because the interest rates that are paid on the debt that's being accumulated are very low. But government in the United States of America would come to a screeching halt over a relatively brief period if interest rates return to their normal level. That's not a forecast that they will. Right now, the federal government can borrow at 2.8% for 30 years, which is amazing. But there's extreme risk to the whole viability of government, not just in the US, but in many other countries too, that is associated with just a large amount of borrowing. Okay, so I guess we have 5 more minutes, right? Isn't that clock is off by an hour, right? I didn't really take that much time. I think we have just a few minutes.
We have time for a few questions. Is that right?
I think so. I'm done.
Any questions?
Yes.
Well, if you reduce capital taxes massively because of capital stock to go up, I'm guessing that would have an effect on interest rates, which might affect those things.
Yeah, if we understood interest rates, which I don't think we do. First of all, interest rates are a world phenomenon, but of course the U.S. is a non-trivial fraction of the world. So that's not a reason not to look at financial equilibrium, global financial equilibrium. There's been a lot of discussion, but not a lot of conclusions about why interest rates have fallen so much since roughly 2000. It is a worldwide phenomenon that's been well documented. Real interest rates in every major currency have declined in parallel. So I agree with your point. Everyone's tax policy and every other kind of policy and every other kind of development feeds into the global capital market. How that capital market works is still up in the air. I wouldn't venture a guess as to the magnitude. So recently it seems like it's just impervious. No matter, everyone writes such low interest rates can't go on, and then interest rates fall some more. So I don't know. It's just remarkable. And it seems to have generated this new mentality in government that you can spend without ever having to pay it back. That sort of works for now, but how long it'll work is eventually, presumably, our forecasts of world real interest rates will come in on the low side, but they've been consistently on the high side, this perplexing decline, which makes government very easy now. There's been no increase in the interest burden on the federal government in this period of very large deficits, because interest rates have fallen enough to take account of the increase in the amount of debt. The product of the two, which is the amount of interest paid, hasn't risen very much, and it's a tiny fraction of the budget today. So we're a long way from, but still there's a prospect, there's a tail probability that all this debt is going to come back to haunt us at some time in the future. So that's something that has been on my brain recently.
This is a little bit off topic, but
It's okay.
wonder if there is a standard channel in macroeconomics of labor productivity growth ending up in wages. I wonder why some labor productivity doesn't end up in dividends, doesn't end up in land values. I'm a little perplexed as to a tight relationship between higher output per worker and higher wage per worker.
Okay, so if you were talking about total factor productivity, then I would agree with what you're saying, that it gets capitalized. Whatever's scarce, when there's an increase in productivity is going to gain. Now, labor is scarce, so labor gains, but it's not, like you mentioned, land. Certainly where I live, land has become astronomically expensive. Nobody I know could afford to buy their house anymore, certainly not me. So everything that's scarce is going to benefit if there's an increase in total factor productivity. By definition, labor productivity is the relation between what labor actually gets so I think you have to be careful with these definitions. But yeah, if something makes it possible to produce more output, then measured in output, prices of anything scarce, labor, land, good ideas, anything that commands the scarcity is going to command a higher value. I agree with that.
Well, I think
Okay, we're right on time.
Right on time, so just want to say thanks very much for
My pleasure.